is a little difficult for me to do nowadays because I'm like almost a solid bone now.
For decades, Mick Mars stayed quiet while the chaos of Mötley Crüe played out in headlines. But now, at 73, he's finally speaking out. And what he's revealing isn't just surprising, it's explosive. The secrets, the betrayal, the truth the band hoped would never come out. Mick is done protecting the image. What really went on behind the scenes? Why did he stay silent for so long? His truth is raw, emotional, and it changes everything you thought you knew. They called him a legend, a rock god, the backbone of Mötley Crüe's sound. But long before the lights, the tours, and the fame, Mick Mars was just a quiet kid from Indiana, living in pain and chasing a dream no one thought was possible for someone like him. Born Robert Allen Deal in 1951, Mick didn't grow up in luxury. His family struggled, and by the time they moved to California, Mick was already dealing with something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: constant, growing pain in his spine. By the time he was a teenager, he was diagnosed with ankylosing spondylitis, a rare and brutal form of arthritis that slowly fuses the bones of the spine together. Imagine being a kid barely able to stand straight, feeling your body stiffen more each year, and still picking up a guitar and saying, "I'm going to be a rock star." That was Mick. He didn't care that the odds were stacked against him. Music wasn't just his dream, it was his way out of pain, out of the noise in his head, out of the fear that his body would betray him completely. Even after a factory job accident left his hand injured, he didn't quit. He walked away from steady work, knowing it would be hell to survive, and threw himself into music full-time. He played in bar bands all across Southern California, often for scraps, slowly building a name for himself as the guy who didn't talk much but could make a guitar scream. He had this eerie, emotional playing style that stood out in every room. It was like he channeled every bit of pain and frustration into the strings. Eventually, he let go of his old name and became Mick Mars, a symbol of reinvention. That wasn't just a stage name, it was a shield, a new identity for someone who had spent years being ignored, doubted, and physically broken. He answered an ad looking for a guitarist in a new band, and the rest is history. But what most people never saw was that even as the spotlight found him, Mick was still hurting. Every day, every show, every song. And yet, he never stopped playing. Because this wasn't just about music, it was about survival. When people think of Mötley Crüe, they often picture chaos, loud parties, wild shows, and headlines that scream trouble. But what really built the band wasn't just the attitude or the leather jackets. It was the sound. And behind that sound, quietly holding it all together, was Mick Mars. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the flashiest, and he definitely wasn't the one causing the most drama. But when Mick plugged in his guitar, everything changed. That's when the real power kicked in. It all started in 1981 when Mick, already a seasoned guitarist by then, answered an ad in a Los Angeles newspaper. The ad was placed by Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee, two young, hungry musicians looking for someone to complete their new band. Mick was older than them. He looked rough, sounded rougher, and had this serious vibe that made you stop and pay attention. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just came in, plugged his guitar into the amp, and unleashed a sound so raw and heavy that it filled the room like thunder. That was it. That was the sound they were missing. From day one, Mick Mars wasn't there to follow the rules. He was there to break them, musically, at least. He didn't move like the rest of the band on stage, and he didn't care about what was trendy or radio-friendly. His focus was tone, grit, and feeling. He played like a man who had lived through hell and was using the guitar to scream back at the world. It wasn't polished or pretty. It was real. And that became Mötley Crüe's foundation. Their debut album, Too Fast for Love, came out the same year. It wasn't backed by a big label at first. It was raw and dirty, just like the Sunset Strip scene they came from. But what made it hit hard wasn't just the rebellious lyrics or glam rock attitude, it was Mick's guitar. Songs like Live Wire and Piece of Your Action were built around his chunky riffs and nasty solos. He wasn't showing off. He was building something solid, something that punched you in the chest. And the world started to notice. By the time Shout at the Devil dropped in 1983, Mötley Crüe had become more than just a local LA band. They were rising stars, and Mick's playing had evolved into something darker, heavier, and more defined. Songs like Looks That Kill and Too Young to Fall in Love became anthems thanks to those thick, unforgettable guitar lines. Mick's tone wasn't just a sound, it was a signature. You could hear one note and know it was him. While the rest of the band leaned into their wild side, the drugs, the drinking, the women, and the non-stop chaos, Mick kept his distance. He wasn't interested in being a rock star in the same way. His life had already been filled with pain, real pain. Not the kind that comes from a hangover, but the kind that lives in your bones. So he focused on his music. Night after night, tour after tour, Mick carried the weight of the sound. Even when he could barely stand, he played through it. As the band dropped albums like Theater of Pain and Girls, 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 Mick's guitar work became even more important. These albums marked a shift. The band was growing, experimenting, becoming more theatrical. But the core stayed the same. Mick's heavy blues-influenced riffs. On tracks like Home Sweet Home, you could feel his range, not just loud and aggressive, but emotional, soulful, layered. That was something unique about Mick. He could play something loud enough to shake an arena, then turn around and make his guitar cry in a way that made you stop and feel something. By the time Dr. Feelgood arrived in 1989, Mötley Crüe had become one of the biggest bands in the world. Stadiums, platinum records, endless headlines. They had it all. And again, at the center of it was Mick Mars. The title track, Dr. Feelgood, was one of the band's hardest-hitting songs. And the riff? Pure Mick. Sharp, punchy, unforgettable. It grabbed you the second it hit and didn't let go. That song became one of the band's most iconic tracks. And a lot of that had to do with how Mick crafted its rhythm and flow. But even as the band got bigger, the pressure on Mick grew too. Touring was becoming harder. The lights were brighter, the crowds louder, but behind the scenes, Mick was barely hanging on. His disease, ankylosing spondylitis, was getting worse. His spine was fusing more. Moving hurt, standing hurt, breathing sometimes hurt. Yet every night, he showed up, walked on stage, and played like nothing was wrong, because the music was never fake for him. It was the only place he felt free. The others may have soaked up more media attention. Nicky with his songwriting and wild stories, Tommy with his drama, Vince with his frontman flair. But the one constant was always Mick. The band could fight, fall apart, change sounds, take breaks, but Mick's guitar was the anchor. He made sure the core of their music never lost that bite, that edge, that grit. And yet, for all that, Mick was often treated like the silent one, the quiet guy in the back, the one people forgot to mention. But inside the band, they knew. Every time they stepped into a studio, every time they walked on stage, they knew who held it together. Without Mick Mars, there was no Mötley Crüe sound, just noise. His role wasn't just about notes and solos, it was about feel. Mick understood that a riff could hit harder than a drum solo, that a well-placed bend could say more than a whole verse. He was a student of blues, of rock, of soul. And he funneled all of it through the heavy, rebellious spirit of metal. That mix became the band's fingerprint. Through all of it, the fights, the fame, the burnouts, and comebacks, Mick stayed true to the sound. Even when the spotlight moved elsewhere, even when his body told him to quit, he kept showing up. Not because he needed applause, but because he had built something, and he wasn't about to let it fall apart. Mick Mars may not have fit the usual mold of a rock icon. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, and didn't crave the attention, but that's what made him different. He let his guitar do the talking, and over 4 decades, that guitar spoke louder than any headline ever could. He was the misfit in the shadows, and the legend in the sound. For years, fans saw Mötley Crüe as a brotherhood, a band of wild, loud, hard-living rock stars who had survived everything together. They were chaos and glory, all wrapped into one. But behind the smoke, the stage lights, and the massive riffs, something darker had been building for a long time. Something that wasn't about music. It was about power, control, and betrayal. And when it finally cracked, nobody saw it coming. Not even Mick Mars. Mick had always been the quiet one. While Nikki Sixx wrote most of the lyrics and Tommy Lee and Vince Neil soaked up the spotlight with their wild personalities, Mick was in the back, doing the thing that held it all together, playing guitar like no one else could. His riffs gave the band its edge. His tone gave it its weight. Without Mick, there would have been no Live Wire, no Kickstart My Heart, no Dr. Feelgood. And through all the partying, scandals, and public meltdowns, Mick just kept going. He wasn't in it for fame. He was in it for the music. Always had been. But time has a way of wearing things down. And not just bodies. Relationships too. By the time the 2010s rolled around, Mötley Crüe had become more of a business than a band. Stadium tours, legacy shows, documentaries, licensing deals. It was big money. And with that came contracts, lawyers, and pressure. Lots of pressure. Mick, who had been quietly suffering from ankylosing spondylitis for decades, was struggling more and more to keep up with the physical demands of touring. His spine was deteriorating. The pain was constant. Every show left him wrecked. But he never quit. Not once. Then in 22, it all changed. Mick Mars made the announcement. He was retiring from touring due to his health. He was clear. He wasn't quitting the band, just stepping off the road. But within days, Mötley Crüe released a statement that didn't match Mick's tone. It felt cold, businesslike, and final. And just like that, John 5 was announced as his replacement. No ceremony, no heartfelt goodbye, no proper recognition for 40 years of loyalty. For Mick, it felt like a knife in the back. That's when everything started to unravel. What fans didn't know, not yet anyway, was that behind the scenes, there had been a slow and quiet shift happening in the band. Mick claims he was pushed out, not gently encouraged to rest, but pressured to give up his share of the band's earnings, a 25% stake that he'd earned through decades of sacrifice, physically, emotionally, and artistically. According to Mick, his so-called brothers wanted to cut him out of the business side of Mötley Crüe. They wanted the name, the brand, the money, without the man who helped build it. In October 2023, Mick filed a lawsuit, and the details that came out shook the rock world. Mick claimed that the band had been faking parts of their live performances, accusing Nikki Sixx of not playing bass live and saying Tommy and Vince relied heavily on backing tracks. He said the band had been gaslighting him for years, treating him like he was losing his memory, blaming his illness for mistakes that weren't his. He alleged that they mocked his condition, spoke behind his back, and pushed to remove him from the band entirely, not just off stage, but out of the business that bore his blood, sweat, and soul. It was ugly. It was personal. And it wasn't the kind of rock and roll drama anyone expected. For fans who had idolized the band's ride or die image, it felt like a betrayal. This wasn't just about money or music. It was about brotherhood, or the illusion of it. Mick had been the backbone of Mötley Crüe, and now he was being treated like a disposable part. The guy who had stood in the background for 4 decades, never asking for the spotlight, was now standing front and center, not with a guitar, but with legal papers. Mick wasn't out to destroy the band. He was fighting for his legacy. He wanted the truth to be heard. He wanted credit for what he built. Because while others were flying off drum risers or crashing Ferraris, Mick was building the sound that made Mötley Crüe matter. And now, he was watching the same people he'd trusted try to erase him from the story. The lawsuit tore a hole in the band's reputation. Fans split into sides. Some defended Nikki, Vince, and Tommy, saying business is business. Others stood with Mick, arguing that loyalty should matter more than money. And through it all, Mick stayed mostly quiet. No shouting matches on social media, no drama interviews, just the truth, laid out in court, in black and white. It wasn't just a legal battle. It was personal war. A man who had survived his body breaking down, who had kept a band alive with his riffs, was now being told he didn't belong, that his time was up, that he wasn't worth 25%, that maybe he never was. But Mick never asked for pity. What he asked for was respect. He knew he wasn't the front man. He didn't want the flash or the headlines. He just wanted to be recognized for the music, for the riffs that made Mötley Crüe sound like thunder, for the sacrifices, the years of touring while in constant pain, the loyalty he showed when others faltered, and for the simple fact that without Mick Mars, there wouldn't have been a band to fight over in the first place. In the end, this wasn't just the story of a legal fight. It was the story of how a quiet man with a guitar became the heart of a loud band, and how that heart was nearly ripped out when it wasn't convenient anymore. It's a reminder that fame fades, and friendships in the music world can crack under pressure. But what doesn't fade is legacy. And Mick Mars faced, whether in court or in pain, made damn sure that nobody could take that from him. At 73, most rock legends are done. Their stories have been told, their songs already etched into music history. But Mick Mars isn't like most. For decades, he stood in the shadows of one of rock's wildest bands, silently carrying the weight of Mötley Crüe's sound on his back. Literally, while battling a disease that made every move painful. He never asked for the spotlight. He never demanded center stage. But now, after years of silence, betrayal, and being pushed aside, Mick Mars is stepping into the light. And, this time, it's on his own terms. For years, Mick's story had been swallowed up by the chaos of Mötley Crüe. The drug-fueled headlines, the fights, the scandals, all of it had a way of drowning out the quiet strength of the man behind the guitar. While the rest of the band soaked up the attention, Mick stayed in the background, head down, fingers on strings, letting his music speak louder than any interview ever could. But when he left the band's touring lineup in 22, everything shifted. At first, the announcement seemed respectful, a simple statement about health issues. But the truth that followed hit like a hammer. Mick didn't retire because he wanted to. He retired because his body gave him no choice. Ankylosing spondylitis had been wrecking his spine for years, and the band he helped build, according to Mick, they used his pain as an opportunity to push him out, not just off the stage, but out of the band's business entirely. Suddenly, the quiet guy had something to say, and he said it through a lawsuit, exposing what he saw as years of betrayal, manipulation, and being treated like a replaceable part. But that wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something new. After decades of being tied to one identity, Mötley Crüe's guitarist, Mick Mars finally had space to ask himself, who am I without them? And the answer didn't come in the form of a tabloid quote or a tell-all book. It came through music. For the first time in his life, Mick began writing and recording his very own solo album. No flashy bandmates, no compromises, no expectations to fit into someone else's vision. Just Mick, raw, real, and finally free to create on his own terms. The album, titled The Other Side of Mars, became more than just a music project. It was a declaration, a way to reclaim his voice. And it wasn't polished like pop rock. It wasn't made for charts or to chase trends. It was dark, gritty, and unapologetically him. The riffs were heavy, the lyrics personal, and the entire sound felt like a man finally unleashing decades of held-back expression. You could hear the pain, the struggle, but also the strength in every note. There was a song called Killing Breed, aggressive, haunting, and honest. It wasn't about revenge, it was about survival, about finally letting out everything he'd kept inside while others played games around him. Another track, Loyal to the Lie, dug even deeper, seemingly reflecting the betrayal he'd faced from those he once called brothers. But this album wasn't just about airing dirty laundry. It was about healing, about proving, even at 73, that his story wasn't over, that it never had to be. Recording the album was a physical and emotional challenge. Mick's condition hadn't improved. In fact, it was worse. Long hours in the studio left him drained, in pain, sometimes barely able to move. But for the first time, the struggle felt worth it, because every riff, every word, was his. Not a piece of a band, not background noise to someone else's drama. His. Working with producer Michael Wagner, a name legendary in the rock world, gave Mick the freedom to stretch creatively. They didn't aim to make another Mötley Crüe record. This was never supposed to be that. It was something deeper, something more personal. A little blues, a lot of metal, and a whole lot of grit. The feedback from fans and critics? Respect. Even those who weren't die-hard Crüe fans recognized the authenticity. It didn't sound like someone chasing relevance. It sounded like a man reclaiming what had always been his, the music. And as the album began to reach listeners, something remarkable happened. People started talking about Mick in a way they hadn't before. Not as the quiet one in the background, not just the guy who stood still on stage while the others ran wild, but as a true artist, a survivor, a craftsman, someone who had given his life to music, been chewed up and spit out by the business, and still came back swinging with a guitar in hand. For Mick, the release of The Other Side of Mars wasn't just a career milestone, it was a personal resurrection. It gave him back his sense of purpose. It reminded him, and the world, that he wasn't done, That under the pain, the lawsuits, and the decades of being overshadowed, there was still a man who loved music more than anything. And now, that man was finally getting his moment. Interviews around the album showed a new side of Mick too. He was still soft-spoken, still humble, but there was a confidence now. Not cocky, not angry, just a quiet knowing that he'd done the work, that he'd survived the worst of it, and that, against all odds, he was still standing, still playing, still creating. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to the band, not to the industry, not even to himself. The fans saw it too. For many, this solo album felt more honest than anything the band had released in years. And it came at the perfect time, a moment when rock fans were craving something real. Mick didn't give them auto-tuned vocals or overproduced gimmicks. He gave them soul. He gave them stories. He gave them truth. The kind that can only come from a lifetime of struggle, loyalty, heartbreak, and resilience. And maybe that's the real victory. Not the chart numbers or critical reviews, but the fact that, at 73, when so many had written him off, Mick Mars stepped forward, guitar in hand, and said, "I'm still here." Not as the background guy, not as the quiet misfit, but as an artist in his own right. His body may still ache. The scars from years in the music business may never fully fade. But Mick's spirit? It's louder than ever, and with the other side of Mars, he finally got to tell his story. Not with drama, not with bitterness, but with the only thing that's never let him down, his guitar. And this time, every note was all his.